Whenever you're jumping into a new community, trade, hobby, whatever it is, once you start kind of really getting into that, there is quite a bit of technical jargon that can be pretty intimidating for not only people just getting their feet wet, but for people who have been doing it for a long time, and suddenly there is a new wealth of information that's discovered or learned, and they have to play catch up to get into that. And so that's something that I can really relate to. As a person who has spent most of their professional life, so from 13, 14 years old until now, both in the real working world and what I do, I have been surrounded by people with hordes of more knowledge, more experience, higher education, years into it, and just a passion for it that as a neurospicy, jack of all trades, master of none info sponge, I got on pretty well with. Unfortunately, a lot of the times that can happen to those more higher educated, more worldly, knowledgeable people, I would like to think unintentionally, they can end up talking over people's heads or even talking down to them. And that's something that I really want to try to avoid. And hopefully I've gotten across pretty well in all of my videos. And so that's what I want to do today, is bring up a few things of terminology that can make it a little bit more palatable for everybody to use. Because the way that reptile trends are going right now, these terms are going to start to be a lot more commonplace in the regular everyday conversations about proper husbandry and things to do with all these different species of animals. So for everyone who, rightly so, and please continue to do so, who call me out if I ever misspeak or don't quite get something quite right, please continue to do so. But today, if I don't give the absolute most detailed, entire little down to the last cross T and dotted I definitions and examples for some of these things, let's give me a little bit of grain of salt for people who aren't quite into that even, I imagine, because I certainly still do, have to sit there and reread it and scratch my head a couple times. So, apologies for the long intro. We're going to get into these first 5 vocabulary words, and then, hopefully, if I'm not too verbose, into some of the taxonomy, which is, the thing that most people like to fight about in this hobby. So for everyone who's been in it for a while or waiting for here's some new ones, hopefully I will still give you a couple at the end, but essentially I'm going to try to go from the probably most commonplace and the ones that are going to be used the most down to the ones that maybe not necessarily. So to start things off with, let's go with the one that hopefully is one that many of you have heard or you're not quite sure about. This is ectothermic. Ectothermic is essentially just the more correct definition of the age-old word we've been using for half a century, cold-blooded. It, again, is the more correct version of that. We're all familiar with those terms, warm-blooded and cold-blooded. For warm-blooded animals, usually vertebrates, mammals, birds, some fish, they have the ability to eat food and with their internal metabolisms can generate energy and heat with that process. I know it's really dumbed down, but that's essentially the best way that I can describe it fairly quickly. Ectothermic, so for all of our herpetiles, our snakes, our turtles, our frogs, all of those guys, they are ectothermic. That means they don't have that ability to metabolize that and generate their own energy and heat, so they have to get it from an external source. And so for whenever you see those animals out sitting in the sun, that's them doing that. That's them getting that energy and that heat. So for translating that into the hobby, obviously, that's what you need to use to give a proper thermal gradient, which I know that's a whole other one, but that's a little bit more commonplace, where in whatever enclosure you decide to have, that you have the ability to give them a proper amount where they can get the energy, the heat, the light that they need, and then the ability to move away. But you have to give that artificially instead of via the sun. Works pretty well, I think, and it's definitely one that you're going to probably be hearing a whole lot more. The next one up is technically a 2-part word, and that is cryptic basking. So, basking, we all pretty much know what that is, but then cryptic. Outside of this little 2 combo word we have going, you probably already pretty much know what it is, especially with the onset of popularity, thanks TikTok, of cryptids, right? These are things or creatures or beings that are not known to science, that stay hidden, that conceal themselves. And that's kind of what cryptic is. It's something that stays hidden, that conceals itself. And a lot of reptiles, especially snakes and lizards, are cryptic by nature. They want to stay hidden. Even the giant Burmese pythons, anacondas, and king cobras, despite the fact they can eat a lot of things under the sun, still end up being prey to something else. and so they want to stay hidden. However, being ectothermic, that means that they need to regulate their body temperature. And so cryptic basking is a process that they utilize to do both of those things. What it is they will expose sometimes just small parts of their body. If it's a snake, just a coil, their head, their tails, lizards, just part of their body, under the sun in that light while maintaining most of their body still hidden away, so that way they can accomplish both tasks of staying hidden or cryptic and basking to thermoregulate. So, a really good example of that is the Australian black-headed python, where they can keep, sometimes they're more than 8 feet of body length in their burrows while exposing only a small bit of their bodies. That black head, which as we all know, black absorbs heat and light and ultraviolet radiation much more efficiently, and conveniently enough, that's where their eyes are. So that is the only part that's exposed to potential predation, and then they can thermoregulate and stay hidden away. Makes sense. And so for a practical application for husbandry purposes, whatever enclosure you're deciding to use, whenever you give all of your different basking perches and hides and things like that, make sure to provide areas for them to stay concealed, but still being able to expose parts of their bodies. Most of the time, it's like a coil or their heads and necks usually that will be sticking out of that hide and still getting that ultraviolet light, UVA, UVB, and heat from there while still feeling more secure in that hide. This next one is one that a lot of you probably have heard, or at least some of their sister words. This one is crepuscular. Crepuscular essentially refers to different periods of activities of organisms, specifically animals. We've all probably heard of diurnal and nocturnal, which essentially means periods of activity of animals during the day, diurnally, so when the sun's out, and nocturnally, at night when the sun's down. Crepuscular refers to periods of activity of animals that generally are in the hours shortly before and after dawn and shortly before and after dusk. So for a good example of that, think about ball pythons and a lot of species of snakes. Rattlesnakes, garter snakes, a lot of species of lizards and turtles. These are the ones that stay hidden away, sleeping, napping during the hottest parts of the day, the coldest parts of the night, and they're most active during dawn and dusk to get a little bit of that heat, that ultraviolet light to do their eating of whatever prey species or whatever species may have you. So these are a lot of the commonly held species that are kept in captivity. So, for example, I said ball pythons. A lot of the time you will hear from ball python breeders and not so enthusiasts that they will just sit there. They're the pet rock. They only want to stay in their hide all the time. And yeah, they do spend a lot of their time in the hide that you give them. However, if you were to put a ball python in a 12 by 12 by 12 cage, it will utilize a good chunk of that cage if you allow it to, with different branches and hides and things. However, it's not going to be out all the time. It's not going to be out most of the time. However, a lot of the times when they are out are that dusk type period. And that's actually, I have noticed that when I give my animals a 12-hour photo period, they're not all under UVA, UVB light, but when you give them that 12-hour photo period, lights on and off, that when I'm feeding them a lot of times in the evening and the early parts of the night, I'm getting a lot better prey responses from all of the different species that would be considered crepuscular, because that's when they're up. So, makes sense, Next right? up is one that we're probably all very familiar with, that maybe not necessarily just the actual word itself. And this is probably the most technical of them. So again, grain of salt for this one. This word is parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis, as simple as I can be and still being correct, is essentially a type of asexual reproduction. Plenty of different species out there can reproduce asexually. Essentially what normal reproduction of most vertebrates, but not just vertebrates, is that the female or whatever type of species it is will essentially create the egg, which through a period of meiosis divides with half the amount of chromosomes that the mom has. So that little one inherits half the chromosomes from mom, and then through the dad, through a spermatophore, whatever may have you, gets the other half of the chromosomes, new life, right? Well, with parthenogenesis, and there is more than one kind out there. Again, it gets very, very technical and very, very in-depth. Essentially, it's a little clone of mom. it gets a complete copy of all of the chromosomes to where essentially it's kind of cloning itself. Most scientists think it's for, at least in our our purview of animals, it's usually either an entire species that is through a parthenogenesis, or it's different ecosystems where there aren't males present. And this is a much older view as well. It may have changed a little bit depending on which scientist you want to argue with, that because there are no male presence in the environment, the female is just making clones of themselves in hopes that future generations, they will be able to either go out forward or males will come in to be able to continue to spread and pass that gene pool down. So remember I talked about entire populations, mourning geckos, whiptail lizards. A lot of you probably know about the little mourning geckos. That is an entire female species that just reproduces parthenogenically, where they're just making eggs on their own and more little baby girls are hatching out. Probably the most famous example of parthenogenesis that a lot of us reptile people are probably familiar with is the Komodo dragon. This has been documented in captivity quite a few times, where female Komodo dragons not being exposed to males, or at the very least not having any sort of mating or courtship or anything like that going on, where they will drop a clutch of eggs and will hatch on their own, and they are genetically identical to their mother. Really, really cool. And again, it gets super, super complicated. Most of the time, they are, different species that have the XY chromosomes, but sometimes there are XO chromosomes or X0 chromosomes or ZW. So it's a whole thing. But for essentially the type of thing that we're doing with, it's a lot of different species have been known to do that, and most of the time they're just clones of mom. Lychee geckos have done it, some snakes have done it, cresties have done it, obviously Komodo dragon, whiptail lizards, a lot of geckos. Now, it's very rare that it will ever be where a female will create a male offspring. However, the copperhead, so North American pit viper, that are really, really cool, they have actually now been known to parthenogenically make a male. Really, really cool. Nigh unheard of prior to a couple of years ago, and not really documented since, but still. Really Last on the list is one that I really like because I discovered this term on my own, and it turns out it applies to one of my favorite species of snakes. This goes along the lines of other periods of activity, similar to that of crepuscular, diurnal, and nocturnal. And while there are a few other ones out there, this is the one that is probably the most common outside of those three. And this is the term cathemeral. Cathemeral doesn't mean particularly one set of time during that 24-hour period. It's different intermittent periods of activity and dormancy. And no, they're not going into cremation or hibernation. It's just when they are not active. So they're taking naps, they're hiding away, what a lot of species will do during the middle of the day when they'd still technically be awake, but not active. And what this essentially means, as an example, is a bull snake is a really good example of a cathemeral species of reptile. A bull snake, whenever you go out and you're looking around, those are one of the more common species, at least for us Americans here, that you will find when you're going out looking for snakes. The others being coach whips and garter snakes, different types of rat snakes. Specifically, the bull snake, they can be out at any real time of the day. In fact, it's been 100 degrees outside, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hottest part of the day, and I've seen bull snakes and coach whips on a dirt road out in the middle of sun with no cover, actively hunting and looking for things. We've seen them in the middle of the night, morning, dawn, dusk, and that's why that is that they are just active at all times during the day, just depending on weather or the time of the year or the day and night cycles or the presence of food. They will just adjust the different periods they're active. Another more fuzzy example of that would be a lion. We've all heard that lions sleep for 20 hours a day. Well, kind of true, but also kind of not. And that's because they actively are participating in social things, in hunting, all these other cool things during all different periods of the day. And then the other periods, they're sleeping. So they could be sleeping or hunting at midnight, noon, 2 a.m., 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 10 o'clock at night. So really, really cool. And so as an example in the hobby, if you have a bull snake or a pine snake, gopher snake, coach whip, racer, if you're from an area where they call those racers, you will notice that during the day, not all of your reptiles are out. Sometimes the lizards might be basking, or they'll go by and they'll kind of take off. But you'll notice that a lot of those Pituophis, those bulls and pines, will be out kind of checking to see what you're doing. And it's because they're just kind of up all the time. Really, really cool.
Turns out, after recording it about 6 different times and doing all of the edits, it really does seem like the taxonomy part is going to need to be another video. So, hope you enjoyed this one, and stay tuned for the next part coming soon.